Welcome to this special session of ACS Science Talks as we proudly celebrate a historic milestone 150 years of the American Chemical Society. We are delighted to mark this occasion with an inspiring session by Professor Emily A. Carter. ACS Science Talks is a virtual lecture series featuring scientific talks by specialists on specialized topics for a specialized audience. I am Pragati and I am joined by Dr. Diksha Gupta, Director, Global Strategy for Society Programs, American Chemical Society, ACS International India, and Dr. Jyotishman Das Gupta, Professor at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, India. So I would like to invite now Dr. Diksha Gupta to take ahead the session and introduce our speaker and, of course, Professor Das Gupta. Over to you, Diksha.
Thank you so much, Pragati. Today is such a special day. I'm joined by two eminent personalities. So let me start introduction with my co-host today, Professor Jyotishman Das Gupta. He received his 5-year integrated master's degree in chemistry from Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur in 2000. Subsequently, he moved to Princeton University as a Hughes Stott Taylor Graduate Fellow, where he carried out his PhD work in the field of oxygenic photosynthesis under the supervision of Professor G. Charles Dismukes. In 2006, he moved to UC Berkeley, where he did his postdoctoral work with Professor Richard Mathis. He joined TIFR Mumbai in 2010 and has been there ever since. The central theme of his research group is to probe dynamic structural events leading to change generation in molecular materials in order to fabricate bio-inspired molecule-based devices for photocatalysis and solar electricity generation. He is on advisory board of many ACS journals, including Chemical Reviews, JPC Letters, Journal of Physical Chemistry, and the American Institute of Physics Journal, Journal of Chemical Physics. With that brief introduction, I invite Jyotishman to join me in welcoming Professor Emily A. Carter. She is a world-renowned scholar. Yes, Jyotishman.
Thank you, Diksha, and welcome everyone.
Professor Carter is a world-renowned scholar at Princeton University's Inaugural Andlinger Professor in Energy and Environment. Professor Carter is a visionary administrative leader. She served at Princeton's Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment founding director, Princeton's Dean of Engineering and Applied Science, UCLA's Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, and now Princeton's Plasma Physics Laboratory's Senior Strategic Advisor and Associate Laboratory Director for Applied Materials and Sustainability Sciences. With a career spanning chemistry, material science, mechanical and aerospace engineering, and applied and computational mathematics on the faculties of UCLA and Princeton. She pioneered development and application of quantum simulation techniques, enabling design of molecules and materials for sustainable energy and carbon mitigation. She has co-authored nearly 500 publications, patents, and codes. She has mentored nearly 100 postdoctoral fellows and PhD students. Professor Carter has delivered over 600 invited keynote and plenary lectures worldwide. Her many honors include election to the US National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, US National Academy of Inventors, US National Academy of Engineering, European Academy of Sciences, and as a foreign member of Great Britain's Royal Academy. She strategically lends her expertise to various entities, such as the US National Academies, where she chaired a 3-year congressionally mandated study on carbon utilization. She guides private science foundations, such as launching a Siemens Foundation initiative on solar radiation management, science, and serving on Kavli Foundation's board of directors. With the federal government as a member of multiple national laboratory advisory and review boards. She advises companies, such as chairing the scientific advisory board for a direct ocean capture startup company. She earned her BS in chemistry from UC Berkeley and her PhD in physical chemistry at Caltech, followed by a brief postdoc at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is an academic great-great-granddaughter of Madame Marie Curie. With that introduction, we are thrilled and honored to have Professor Carter today with us. Now, stage is yours, Professor Carter.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Is it fine? Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking the organizers and the American Chemical Society, especially the Indian branch, for inviting me to present to you today. And I think it is a real marker in time to celebrate the fact that the American Chemical Society has existed for 150 years. Of course, chemistry has existed for much longer than that, and it will exist for much longer than that. And I find myself talking about that, especially in the United States at this point, quite often, that, no matter what is going on in the world, science will prevail. It is something which we have the privilege of participating in, being part of a long history and laying the foundations for the future. And that's, in fact, what this talk is about. So you see, and you heard that what matters most to me is doing everything that I can for as long as I can to help people and our world move onto a sustainable path with respect to energy and how we take care of the environment. And in particular, the area that I think chemists and many others beyond chemists can contribute to is an area that has not been the focus yet, but is starting to gain momentum. And it's this area that I have dubbed electromanufacturing, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I need to start, first of all, by thanking my current team. I will mostly talk about the way I think about these problems, but I will give you some examples from our research. And so it's really important that I thank the current team, which is listed here. In particular, Mark Martirez, who started as a postdoc with me, but has been on this journey with me for a long time. He's now an independent scientist at the Department of Energy National Lab that I help co-lead, the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. But he still works with me. And then my current team is listed here. And then I want to also thank former postdocs that have been with me most recently, whose work I hope to have time to touch on, who are now at other places, including as faculty and also in industry. Okay, so with that, let me start to give you a little bit more detail as to what I'm talking about. I mean, if we think about what it means for a sustainable future, I am going to shamelessly advertise an inaugural editorial piece that the editor-in-chief of the Journal of American Chemical Society asked me to pen, and it's about what scientists can do to help reach a sustainable future. And so that was published a year and a half ago now. But what it talks about is that if we think holistically about our future, and that op-ed that I wrote is not just about sustainability, it's about all the ways in which chemists can contribute to a thriving civilization. But in terms of sustainability, I list here carbon emission-free electricity. Notice it doesn't say renewable electricity. Renewable is a form of carbon emission-free, but there are other forms as well that at this point we need to rely on, and that includes nuclear. And the reason I am focused on carbon emission-free is, of course, because we have dumped way too much carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which is warming our planet and causing all sorts of problems that I don't need to tell all of you about. And the reason it's in black here as opposed to orange, black and orange are Princeton colors, is that we really know how to do this already. Okay, so it's not an area, although it is an area, and it is an area a couple decades ago that I did research in, and people are still doing research in. It's not as urgent as this other area that I want to speak about. If we then think about, well, okay, so we have to have electricity to power our world. What do we use that electricity for? We also know how to electrify at least ground-based transportation quite well. We know how to electrify heating and cooling in buildings and for lighting. So that's not a big area of research. But this area of electrifying industry, that is something which really has not been a focus. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Beyond that, when we think about a sustainable future, we have to recognize that not all transport is ground-based. And so if we think about heavy-duty transportation, such as long-range aviation, long-range shipping, it's going to be very hard to electrify those. And so we will need carbon-neutral fuels for that. So that can actually be achieved also through electrification, as we'll talk about today. Of course, those sources of propulsion in heavy-duty transport are going to produce CO2. We're still going to be, there's lots of what are called hard-to-abate sectors that will still be emitting CO2. So we have to be thinking about both in terms of our current society, but in terms of all the CO2 that is already in the atmosphere, how do we capture it and either utilize it or store it? And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. And then, we're in a situation, so this is really thinking holistically about our future, that we may not do this all fast enough. And if we don't do it fast enough, we may need to find ways to reflect sunlight for a while. And so that's this area of solar radiation management. And it was mentioned in the introduction that I am initiated with the Simons Foundation, an international collaboration that is ongoing now on the science of aerosols that might be used in this case, if we have really no other choice. It's risky, and so that's why it says if no other choice. I would certainly rather not do it, but I'd rather understand the science in case we're in a situation where we have no other choice. But today, we're going to talk about electromanufacturing, and I will define that in a moment. And it says quantum-based simulations because I'm a theorist, and so I'm going to tell you about the work we do to help interpret experiments and make suggestions for experiments to understand how to make products using clean electricity. So I thought I'd just spend 1 second, 1 minute, giving you, for those of you that don't know me, a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. So you see the Schrodinger equation here in the middle, and basically this is a diagram that two of my former postdocs lovingly put together as the front piece for a Festschrift issue that came out now 5 years ago on the work from my group, and it just illustrates in this sort of stained glass window way both the fact that my group has been heavily involved in both developing quantum-based methods and applying them to a whole range of problems. And so at the corners, you see the areas in which we have contributed in terms of developing what are called embedding theories. I'll have something to say about that in a moment. Orbital-free DFT, so that's a linear scaling form of density functional theory. Reduced scaling electron correlation methods. These are approximations to the Schrodinger equation, as well as input from quantum-based methods into multi-scale ways of treating, as well as ab initio MD and ab initio Monte Carlo, kinetic Monte Carlo in particular, and multi-scale methods for treating mechanical properties of materials. And they've been applied to all of these different methods, all these different applications that you see. But in particular, in the last 20 years, we've focused on sustainable energy and carbon mitigation, as was mentioned. And so if I just say that there's a whole range of problems that if you're interested, that we've worked on related to clean electricity in terms of alternative photovoltaics, solid oxide fuel cells, fusion reactor walls, and then biofuel combustion, for clean electricity. And then I'm not going to talk about any of that today, but just want you to know about it in case you're interested in looking into that work. What I will be talking about today is things, again, related to electromanufacturing. We've done a lot of work on photoelectrochemical cells, converting for CO2 conversion, electrochemical cell conversion to split water, for example, for water oxidation, and I'll be talking about electrolysis of CO2 reduction. We also have done a lot of work related to light harvesting by metal nanoparticles that produce these things called plasmons to do photocatalysis. I'll give you an example of that. We've done a lot of work on solar thermochemical syngas production, materials discovery for that. We're no longer working on that. That's why it's in gray. In fact, this entire office has now been dismantled by the current government and in the United States. We are now working on CO2 mineralization in seawater. We are also working on ammonia conversion, both synthesis and decomposition. I'll talk about that, and electrocatalytic synthesis of ammonia. So I'm not obviously going to touch on all of that, but I want to give you a sense of the scale of how we have been holistically addressing all of these problems. So what is electromanufacturing? And I have here this advertisement. We've started an initiative at the National Lab, the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, called Electromanufacturing Science. And it's essentially saying, how can we use electricity to synthesize chemicals and materials, specifically via catalysis? And what does it offer to us beyond the normal manufacturing? Because if you think about it, most synthesis of chemicals and materials are done using thermal methods, so heat, and usually that heat has come from fossil fuels. So if we can use electricity, and if the electricity is clean, we can have a way to abate the CO2 emissions from the manufacturing sector, especially chemical manufacturing sector. So where are we in this world right now? Well, we know that we can do electrocatalysis. We can do, there are certainly many examples of it. We know that, for example, it is possible to do electrochemistry at scale because that's how aluminum is produced. But electrocatalysis is largely still at very low technology readiness levels, and it's still too costly. So there are a bunch of startups, which is great. And this is showing examples of CO2 being converted by, for example, sputtered copper. So there's opportunities to work in this field, in this area. And so we are doing so, as are many others. And then I mentioned, for example, plasmonic photocatalysis. There's a startup company that I'm not involved in, but it was co-founded by Naomi Hallis and Peter Nordlander, who are longtime collaborators of mine on this plasmonic photocatalysis, where the light is coming from LEDs. And so you can imagine using electricity to provide this, instead of sunlight, to provide so clean electricity to provide the sunlight in an industrial setting. So that's already going on, but again, it's at the startup scale. Another one, which is even earlier on, is a very recently reported, and I'll talk about an example of this, using electricity to generate heat, so resistively, so-called joule heating, to be able to do thermocatalysis. And so again, you're getting rid of the thermal process, but the beauty of it too is that the electricity, because you can turn it on and off quickly, you can imagine seeing if you get different results by pulsing the heat. And we'll talk about that. In fact, you can have increased energy efficiency and you can improve yields, as you'll see in a moment. Another area, which is very close to the expertise of the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, is to use plasmas in the presence of a catalyst in order to synthesize chemicals or possibly materials as well. And we know that in fact plasmas have been used to do methane pyrolysis to make hydrogen and carbon black by a company in the United States. That's been proven at scale. Turns out they don't use a catalyst. So there are opportunities to see whether introducing catalysts can actually help beyond what they've already done. So this is a whole new area that is open for business. And then finally, this is showing the front cover of the second report that came out of the study that was mentioned in the introduction. I chaired this committee on carbon utilization for the U.S. National Academies. It was a 3-year U.S. Congress mandated study to look at markets, infrastructure, and research and development and policy. And one of the things that we mentioned in this report is the opportunity for looking at whether or not we can get better efficiency, better yield through pulsing. So again, using electricity, through combining some of these processes, either in a hybrid form, all in one unit, or in tandem processes. So there's a whole research agenda that you can download at this site if you're interested. Okay, so what is our current focus in my group? Given the different roles that I'm playing now, I've really focused down on a couple of problems, and they have to do with ammonia and carbon dioxide conversion by electrically driven catalysis. And in particular, why are we focusing on those? I mean, the CO2 is obvious. For ammonia, the reason is because in certain countries like Japan, ammonia is being considered as a potential fuel to use in power plants. But in addition, ammonia is being thought, I mean, obviously ammonia is used as for at least half of the agricultural fertilizer in the world, either ammonia itself or ammonia being converted to urea. And the point is that ammonia also potentially could serve as a hydrogen carrier. So that, and in fact, that's what we're thinking about here, is that can you take hydrogen that hopefully you make in a clean way and nitrogen from the air, make ammonia, use it because it's much easier to transport ammonia than hydrogen. And then where you need hydrogen, you decompose it potentially in order to make the hydrogen you need on demand. Of course, there are issues all the way along that require research, because every one of those processes will not be done with 100% efficiency. So there are trade-offs, but there are cases where this makes a lot of sense. And it would be good to replace the Haber-Bosch process, which is over 100 years old. It works, but it's incredibly energy intensive and is responsible for a lot of CO2 emissions, especially with respect to the way that the feedstock hydrogen is produced. So that's what we're focused on, and we're focused on quantum-based simulations that actually mostly go beyond density functional theory because of various limitations of density functional theory that I'll talk about on this slide. So in particular, I mentioned already this electrical pulsed heating and quenching. Here we do use DFT because everything that is going on here are ground-based or ground state-based phenomena, and they don't involve electron transfer as other things I'm going to talk about. So DFT is fine, and we use that as input into microkinetic modeling, and I'm going to show you about some of the results that we have associated with that. And then secondly, I mentioned already, we do this work on plasmon-induced photocatalysis. And here is where we have to go beyond density functional theory, because the accuracy of density functional theory for treating excited states within time-dependent DFT, for example, is limited, especially if you're thinking about kinetics. And then if charge transfer is involved, there are also issues associated with the way that density functional theory approximations treat the electron exchange correlation. And so we solved that problem through a theory that we have developed now over a couple of decades in different forms. And now it's basically being used routinely, where we essentially divide the system up into a reactive site. Here's an example of such a reactive site, where we refine the description of excited states, electron transfer, using so-called correlated wave function theory, where the rest of the system the physics of that is taken into account by a so-called embedding potential. Once we do that, we can actually treat quite accurately both excited states and charge transfer. It's not perfect, but it has the right physics in it. And so I'll tell you about I'll give an example from that as well. Okay, and then lastly, electrolysis. So we are doing work related to electrolytic CO2 conversion. And again, I mentioned the problem of charge transfer, also an issue associated with HOMO-LUMO gaps or band gaps that are not treated well within standard density functional theory. We fix that with the embedded correlated wave function theory. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about it, but we've now combined this embedding theory in liquids to be able to look at this problem of CO2 conversion to carbonates for mineralization. And we do that using rare event molecular dynamics, which then is refined with this embedded correlated wave function theory. So we'll see what I have time to talk about. Anyway, let's talk about this programmable heating and quenching. So this is from a paper that I am not a co-author on, but this is what inspired the work, and we've been working with the co-authors, with the authors of this ever since. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. And the idea here is you have a piece of carbon felt that's attached to electrical leads that you can essentially run a current through this, you can heat it up, and you can cool it down very rapidly. And so that's this idea, is that we're going to put nitrogen and hydrogen into to be exposed to this carbon felt that's going to have catalyst on it, and we're going to try to replace the Haber-Bosch approach in this way. And just to remind everybody about the Haber-Bosch idea is that you take nitrogen and hydrogen, you absorb them on a surface to make nitrogen and hydrogen atoms. That's favored at low temperature, but of course at low temperature the kinetics is really bad because you have to break these very strong bonds. So you want to go to high temperature where you can both break these bonds and form new NH bonds, and then you can also desorb nitrogen. So that's what happens, but of course going to high temperature, and also these have to be operated at high pressure. In the Haber-Bosch approach, that is very energy intensive. So as I mentioned, this pulsed heating and quenching can rapidly switch between high and low temperature, and it's a non-equilibrium continuous synthesis, which in this paper, this is the work of Liang-Bing Hu's group. He led this work. He's at Yale now. This is showing a comparison of their process, this electrically driven process for the rate of ammonia formation as compared to other essentially advances in catalysts, but essentially doing thermal production. And what his group showed is that a standard garden variety iron catalyst, dirt cheap, gets better rates of ammonia production as long as you'd use this process, okay? And so the beauty of this is to recognize that while many of us, including myself, have focused on materials discovery, process discovery is an equally important thing to focus on. So in fact, because you're pulsing electricity and sometimes it's off, in principle, this can get you to lower energy cost, and we see higher performance versus isothermal reactors. So essentially, how does that happen? It happens because this process allows you to access very quickly both favored temperature regimes, and that's what leads to these higher rates. Well, we wanted to dig into this more, and so work led by my colleague Mark Martirez essentially looked initially for other reasons at ammonia decomposition on iron, doing density functional theory calculations. These are and calculating the energetics of ammonia decomposition as a function of coverage of nitrogen-containing species. If you can't actually go above a third of a monolayer on the most stable surface of iron because it's not thermodynamically favorable. He created this thermodynamic cycle where he mapped out all of the thermodynamics and kinetics. And then we take the rates that he calculated, and so going this way is ammonia decomposition, going the other way is ammonia synthesis by microscopic reversibility. So we use those rates in both. We have rates for adsorption, we have rates for surface reaction, and we put that into a microkinetic model code Camtera, and we essentially use all of that information. And just to give you one example of what is probably not surprising to you, the rate determining steps at high temperature for synthesis in all cases have to do with breaking either the hydrogen bond or the H2 bond or the N2 bond. And so we have all of this data that goes into this model. And then what we show is that by pulsing to high temperature, you can overcome this barrier, the nitrogen, that's the overall rate determining step. And you can form the NH bonds. And then by quenching back down, you don't, because you can go in both directions, if you stay at higher temperature, you may get ammonia decomposition. So going to low temperature prevents that ammonia decomposition and while still allowing for ammonia to desorb because it's not that strongly bound. So I'll show you just a couple of results. We're about to submit this work. This is showing you a temperature ramp that is essentially like what the experiments use. That's the waveform. And then what we have done is to vary the minimum and maximum temperature and ask, where do we maximize yield? What kinds of surface intermediates are formed under these pulsing conditions? And we compare that to isothermal conditions as well. So this is showing you two different cases, sort of relatively low temperature, somewhat higher temperature. And basically the purple and the teal are showing you the intermediates that form as a function of time. These are the dominant surface species at these different under these different conditions. The gas that forms, of course, we want to look for ammonia. We need it. What this work showed is that, of course, the average ammonia production really increases going from the lower temperature to this higher temperature. But what's super important too is that we get increased yield versus the isothermal process by doing this pulsing. So that just gives you a sense of what we can do in terms of digging into the details. What we've done in this work that's about to be submitted is we've optimized to get optimal yield, what is the best waveform in terms of minimum maximum temperature and time, which can help inform and optimize that process for making synthesis through Joule heating from clean electricity. Okay, turning on to plasmon-driven catalysis. Again, these are driven by charge transfer and excited state metal surface reactions, and this requires now that we move beyond density functional theory using this embedded correlated wave function theory. There's a review article that we published about 5 years ago in case you're interested in more of those details. But just to give you a sense of the range of problems we've looked at hydrogen activation. Almost much of this is done in collaboration with Naomi Hallis's group, where they do the experiments. We do the theory, along with higher length scale theory done by Peter Nordlander. We've looked at nitrogen activation, making proposals for what are the best catalysts for that. We've looked at methane dry reforming to make syngas. We've looked at a variety of molecules decomposing on different metal nanoparticles for hydrogen production and taking care of greenhouse gas decomposition, et cetera. I'm going to just show you one example, and it focuses on ammonia decomposition. I'm living in a world where I hope we can make ammonia through the Joule heating approach and then transport it perhaps from the United States to India, and then maybe in India, it is LEDs or sunlight are used with metal nanoparticles to decompose it and produce hydrogen on demand. So this is showing you just to give you a sense of where theory plays a role in this work. It's showing you the kinds of measurements that are done in the lab at the macroscopic scale, recognizing that for this particular reaction, where you're taking ammonia and you're passing ammonia over illuminated or not illuminated ruthenium doped copper nanoparticles, which we model as copper 111 because that's the largest, the majority facet on a metal nanoparticle of an FCC metal. And this is showing the hydrogen production rate. And what you can see is with thermocatalysis, you make very little hydrogen, but with photocatalysis, especially when the ruthenium is, when the copper is doped with ruthenium, you get a very large rate. And so, of course, we want to understand where that's coming from. In addition, you can make measurements of the nitrogen production rate, and you can ask, does that production rate depend on ammonia pressure, for example? And that tells you something about the order of the reaction. In thermocatalysis, you see that this is a log-log plot, so the slope is giving you the rate, the reaction order. And here you see that there is no dependence on the ammonia pressure for thermocatalysis, but in photocatalysis, it's first order. And so again, the question is, why is that happening? And that's where the theory actually is providing the insight into understanding where that's coming from. So my former postdoc, Lucas Bao, who's now a professor at Boston College, did these calculations where, and this is the flavor of embedded correlated wave function theory. What you're looking at here is a set of stacked one-dimensional pictures of the ground state, the lowest energy, state, breaking the ammonia, the first NH bond in ammonia, and then looking at a whole variety of excited states that we can calculate with this theory. And what you can see is that this is the barrier in the ground state, so that would be what would be overcome in thermocatalysis, and we can excite with these localized surface plasmons up to this level. And the barrier is lowered in the excited state. So that's a feature we often see. If you look at getting nitrogen off the surface, these are the two most competitive rate limiting steps. Is once you make nitrogen, getting the two nitrogens to recombine and make N2 gas, that's actually hard because the nitrogen is strongly bound to the surface. And so again, you see this incredibly exquisitely complex set of potential energy curves that we can get from this theory. So how can we understand all of this? Well, as I said, the thermocatalysis, which is ground state chemistry, so it is what's going on in this lowest energy curve. What we see is that for the ammonia first NH bond breaking, it has this particular barrier, but the barrier for getting nitrogen off the surface is higher, much higher. And so what that tells you is that that's going to be the rate determining step. And so, in fact, that is why there's zeroth order kinetics here for the thermocatalysis. It doesn't depend on the ammonia at all. It only depends on this step. If we look at photocatalysis, it turns out that excited state chemistry flips the rate determining step. So the rate determining step turns out to be that very first NH bond breaking. And so that is why you get first order kinetics here. And because the barrier is lower, that is why you end up with, whereas here, this is what you see in the thermocatalysis, which is why the reactivity is so low for thermocatalysis and so much higher for photocatalysis. So just to give one more bit of an example here associated with this kind of catalysis, and this was actually done with using the LEDs in this particular paper to show what you can do using LEDs and plasmonic catalysis. So this is showing that, of course, ruthenium is expensive. It would be very nice to be able to use iron, right? And so in fact, in thermocatalysis, though, the iron-doped copper nanoparticles have a hydrogen production rate which is much lower than 2 orders of magnitude lower than ruthenium. And so what happens, though, in photocatalysis is very exciting. In fact, you get rates that are nearly identical. In fact, one can argue that the iron doped is slightly higher than the ruthenium doped. That is really exciting. And again, we wanted to see whether we could explain why that's happening. So again, the same thing is true, and we see this in many different chemistries, that this photocatalysis allows you to access excited state barriers that are much lower than in the ground state. So here's the ground state barriers for iron doped copper, and here they are in the excited state, and the barriers go way down and are lower than the barriers for ruthenium, and that is why you end up seeing this greater activity in the experiment. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about electrocatalysis, and as I had alluded to earlier in an example on the electromanufacturing slide, copper is often used. Why copper? Because people want to make hydrocarbons. You'd like to not have to pull hydrocarbons out of the ground anymore, leading to CO2 emissions, but can we in fact think about recycling the CO2? Yes, it's a daunting prospect, but scientists like challenges, and certainly we need to try to make this happen. Well, copper is the only one of the periodic table that actually makes hydrocarbons like methane and ethylene. And so there's been a lot of work on this. Mark Coper has been a leader, for example, in this area. He's done a lot of beautiful work on understanding and measuring rates of electrochemical CO2 reduction on copper, on different facets of copper. And he's shown that actually CO2 itself is not very relevant. What's relevant is CO reduction, which is rate limiting. So CO2 itself dissociates quite readily to CO on copper. So one starts generally with CO in studies that are looked at. Obviously, if you want to make ethylene, it's fine to potentially make methane if we stop our natural gas production at some point out of the ground. But the fact is that ethylene is an incredibly important feedstock for the chemical industry. And so if we could make ethylene, which of course requires CC coupling, this would be extremely important going forward. So if you look at the modeling literature, most of the electrochemical CO2 reductions have been modeled using density functional theory. There's a problem using density functional theory. I've already pointed out the problems with the fact that charge transfer is not well described with density functional theory because of the so-called delocalization error that exchange correlation functionals have. But in addition, for modeling CO on close packed surfaces, such as copper 111, it's known experimentally that CO wants to sit on top of a metal atom. In DFT always predicts, for the pure DFT functionals, predicts that it sits in a hollow site. It doesn't describe even the structure of the reactant correctly. And so in fact, quite some time ago, we used an earlier version of our embedded correlated wave function theory that showed that because we have the proper description of exchange and correlation in this theory, we predict the correct ad site, the correct structure of CO on copper 111. And so that actually got us inspired to revisit these electrochemical CO2 reduction mechanisms using this theory, which also has the right description of charge transfer and therefore should give a better description of the kinetics. And so we've done a whole series of studies now on CO reduction, on copper 111, on copper 100, both CO reduction, CC coupling on copper 100 and on copper 111. I'm going to just give you one example associated with some work that a materials scientist, faculty member at UCLA while I was serving as executive vice chancellor and provost, Yu Huang, had read some of our work and had said, we have this data looking at defective copper, twin boundary rich copper, doing electrochemical CO2 reduction, and we find something really quite remarkable, which is that this is looking at the Faradaic efficiencies the rates associated with making hydrogen, CO, methane, and ethylene. And I don't have time to go into all the details of this, but this is the key result here, is that twinned copper showed record Faradaic efficiency, so selectivity, for making methane. So again, you'd rather make ethylene, but it's still useful to know that there are ways to change the morphology and get a selective product. And so she wanted to know, could we help her understand that? And in fact, our results from the embedded correlated wave function theory show that the twinned copper compared to planar copper with no defects, in fact, the barriers to forming the C1 products get reduced to essentially zero. Whereas, it's also downhill, whereas the CC barriers basically remain the same as on the planar copper. And so that really helps explain the selectivity to forming methane. So this is the kind of research that we have done in collaboration with experimentalists. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to end with a slide that just shows you the very latest results that were published in 2026. Mark Martires and I just published this work examining on copper 100, which is a very active facet for this CO reduction. It's been proposed over a long time that CO coupling itself is involved in, and this is through DFT calculations, that people have said that CO coupling is involved in this process. And I'm not going to go into the details of this except to show you on this slide that we've mapped out in these papers a whole series of, with extremely rigorous models, what the free energies of activation are for this entire reaction network. And the bottom line is that we've shown that CO coupling itself is not likely to proceed on copper, that in fact it has to be another more hydrogenated, more mobile species that is forming CC bonds. And I'm cognizant of the time, and so unfortunately I'm not going to go into these details about mineralization. I'm sorry about that. I want to just end with one slide that sort of brings it all back together. And that is to say that, you know, in many ways, we have, through international work all over many countries, many scientists and engineers, we have solved much of the sustainable energy problem. We have not solved how we sustainably make the rest of our civilization run. And so that is why we started this Electromanufacturing Science Initiative at PPPL. It also involves Princeton University and other universities as well. I mentioned to you the solar radiation management initiative that we have started with the Simons Foundation to understand in laboratory and modeling research, not field work, how aerosols behave under stratospheric conditions, how they interact with each other, how they interact with light, and potentially how they interact with tropospheric clouds. Carbon management one really needs to think about not just geologic carbon sequestration, and that's why the study that we did for the National Academies, really for the federal government and for the U.S. at large, but this is really for the world. This is a whole. This is giving you a slight sense of from one figure in this report about all the different kinds of ways one can think about converting to different products, different sources of CO2, including thinking about coal waste. And so this study about carbon dioxide removal and utilization is also very important. And then in terms of my own research, I am focused on these electricity-driven transformations that you've seen. And so I want to end by thanking long-standing support from the Department of Energy, from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. This is for the current work that we're doing. BP also had supported some of our work, as well as various parts of Princeton University. This is my current group, more or less. A couple of them have gone on, and these are former group members. And I want to thank all of them and my collaborators and you for your attention. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that we have a chance to have a dialogue.